Welcome to another episode of Bible Reading Today, and I'm glad you've joined us. We're going to begin a new study today, one out of the book of Romans. And you might ask the question, why do we need another study from the book of Romans? Hasn't everything been said that can be said about this most foundational book of the Apostle Paul? I mean, does the world really need another summary of Christian doctrine from Romans? Well, in my years of pastoral ministry, I've become convinced that another study of Romans, focusing on a specific message from Romans, is specifically needed in our day. In my experience, the question most often asked when believers came to me for pastoral counsel was, how can I be sure that I'm really a Christian? Distressingly, this question seldom came from a member of the congregation that you wished would ask it, one whose life bore little evidence of genuine conversion. The people who came to ask about assurance seemed inevitably to be those whose lives bore all the marks of one who had genuinely given their hearts to Christ. And over the years, I came to understand that their question really wasn't about salvation. These folks were saved as far as anyone impartially looking at their lives from the outside could tell. Now, their question wasn't really about salvation. Their question was about assurance. How do I know I'm saved? They were God's people by His grace. But because of a deficient understanding of salvation, what it is, how it's accomplished, who's responsible for it, they lacked assurance of their condition. And the place they needed to be taken to gain a sure footing was Romans. For assurance of salvation is a main theme of this book. Often these dear saints had been to others asking the same question and had received little help because those they sought help from hardly understood the doctrine themselves. And well-meaningly, they often would point these folks to the truths of the gospel once again, and once again lead the seeker in the sinner's prayer in the hopes that what hadn't, quote, worked, unquote, on previous occasions, which were often numerous, would somehow work this time. That hope revealed with clarity the misunderstanding. Both the seeker and the one sought for counsel imagined the problem to be that the seeker, quote, hadn't done it right, unquote, for some reason. And likely, the reason was thought to be that the seeker did not have a sincere enough heart when approaching the throne of grace. And this reveals a misunderstanding of the intersection between grace and faith in those who hold it. It's an imagining that the sinner somehow has to contribute to his or her salvation, rather than simply responding to the grace offered through Christ's sacrifice. And because that really wasn't the difficulty, the supposed remedy proved to be once again fruitless. And once again, help was being sought in the hope that an answer that would make a difference might somehow be found. Well, that hope is in Romans. But in my experience, it requires more than a brief explanation in a pastor's office for most believers to see its relevance. The answer is a truth that needs to be savored, held in one's hand, so to speak, lifted up to the light of consciousness, and grasp for the beauty it contains. And this is what I hope to do through these studies for those earnestly seeking an answer to the question, am I really saved? My plan is to work through the first 8 chapters of Romans, focusing on the subject of assurance. Now, all of Romans is of value, but for our purpose, those chapters are going to suffice. For those seeking a more complete exposition of the book of Romans, I want to heartily recommend Martin Lloyd-Jones's masterful study, available in a multi-volume set from Banner of Truth Publishing. And I can't improve on what is written there, but I may be able to shine some further light for some through these presentations that we're going to do together. So come along with me, and let's work our way through Romans 1 through 8, and together we'll discover God's secret of assurance for worried souls. Now, before the matter of assurance of salvation can be sorted out in anyone's mind, the necessity and the way of salvation must first be established in one's thinking. And for this reason, it's necessary to begin our study in chapter 1 of Romans, since the book opens, beginning in verse 16, with a full explanation of this issue. The great purpose of Romans is given in verses 16 and 17. Romans 1:16 and 17 says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, 'The righteous shall live by faith.'" Now, this book begins with the assumption that everyone everywhere is in need of salvation. And for our purposes, we need only remind ourselves of the tragedy that occurred in the Garden of Eden, when our forefather Adam chose to rebel against God, permitting sin to enter into the world. Adam chose to follow his desires rather than God's command, and the result of that has been disastrous. Every man and woman born into the world is conceived in sin and separated from God by nature. Sin manifests its presence in each one of us by causing us to be spiritually helpless, dominated by our desires rather than truth, self-centered in our thinking. And being helpless, we can do nothing to save ourselves. Because we're dominated by desires rather than truth, we are entrapped by lies. Selfishness in nature is endemic to us, and we're unlovable before a holy God, and often in conflict with other people around us. It's assumed that the reader of Romans realizes these truths and has sought refuge in the power of God for salvation, the gospel of Jesus Christ. This gospel is unapologetically pronounced to be the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. The message itself is the power of God, because the Word of God is never separate from the Spirit of God. So the salvation we need comes through a message, through the good news of Jesus preached in the world, through the Word of God, by the Church of God, resulting in, we are told, salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In other words, this good news is for everyone and results in the righteousness of God being revealed to and applied to everyone who puts their faith in Jesus. A righteous person is one who, like God, is morally blameless, and again, like God, is willing and constantly seeking to give to everyone around them what is due to them. Now, we're obviously not like that by nature, but we have to somehow get that kind of righteousness in order to be accepted by God. Now, the gospel is God's power to gift us with His righteousness, with that very kind of righteousness. When we put our faith in God by trusting what He's done for us in Jesus, He graciously credits to our account the perfect righteousness we need in order to be saved. And this is what faith is. The text tells us that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, meaning that it comes through faith from first to last. In other words, there are no works on our part that can obtain it. It's given solely by grace, which is God doing for us what we can never do for ourselves. And it's received solely by faith, which is trusting and obeying what God has said. And a quotation from Habakkuk 2:4 drives home the point. The righteous shall live by faith, which means that faith is the entry into God's righteousness given to sinners by God's grace. Now, the bold statement made in these two verses is simply this. The salvation we need comes to us through God's provision, through grace. It's received completely by faith, our response to God's good news about Jesus. So the necessity of salvation is that all men and women are sinners by nature and can do nothing to save themselves. And the way of salvation is that God provides His own righteousness to anyone who believes. It's just that simple. The remainder of the book of Romans is simply an explanation in greater detail of what all of that means. And in our next study, we're going to focus on the evidence that we're given that explains to us our need of salvation. We look forward to seeing you then.